Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited for our conversation today on worldview, comparison, paradigm comparison. I'm joined by Dr. Paul Chung. This is the first time that we've had the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation. We're connected by a mutual acquaintance and have got to peek at your work a little bit here and very fascinated by it and excited to explore with you. So welcome to the podcast, Paul. And if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself, give us a little bit of background, then we can dive into the good stuff.
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me. So my background, I guess more professional stuff would suffice. So I have a PhD in theology, but my
Mhm.
concentration is in what's called philosophy of religion or philosophical theology. It sort of interchanges. I have uh, written on the topic of worldviews. So I guess I can go into more personal stuff. So what happened during my university undergraduate years was that
Mhm.
I was sort of agnostic for a while, for a couple
Mhm.
of years, and there was this whole bunch of stuff happened. But if I were to narrow like one strand of it, I experienced something rather interesting, which was that because I looked into various different sort of worldviews and philosophies, that when I was looking into it, it made sense when I put myself into their shoes,
Mhm.
so to speak, right? So if I were, say, studying different branches of Buddhism, and I also study, and these are all at undergraduate level, mind you, but
Sure.
it's enough that you can imagine yourself being, if I thought like that, if I generally like view the world in this way and organize my concepts
Right.
in this particular way, how would it feel like? And when I put myself into that, I'm like, okay, it makes sense. It makes sense of seeing the world as or trying to live out your life with, say, non-attachment, um, oversimplification, obviously,
Sure.
or yeah, it makes sense to see the world from a, say, a scientific materialist point of view, because hey, science does work, and do you really need God? That kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, Nietzsche made a lot of sense. So that was he was a pretty powerful, and I think you mentioned that in your conversations elsewhere. But he's a powerful writer, right? So
Mhm.
like he makes a lot of sense. Um, Christianity made sense before, right? Before I became sort of an agnostic for a few years, and now you have this crisis of beliefs, and it's not simply that you have a crisis of beliefs of your old worldview, like is Christianity true, but more like, okay, what is true? Because not simply in the sense of all of these. I'm not convinced by any one of these, but
Sure.
like the flip side, all of these can be true. So how do you decide? Um, and the other issue was that you can always make a case against these positions if you make yourself step outside of that sort of uh, paradigm, right? But at the same time, if you step yourself into that paradigm, then yeah, you might not be able to completely like prove every one of these beliefs within that worldview.
Mhm.
But at the same time, there's no definitive like case that would knock it out either, which makes sense because that's why these worldviews and religious positions and like anti-religious, that's why they still exist, right? Because if you can knock them out, they would have been knocked out already. Sort of like how, wait, is flat Earth a good example? Because there are earthers, but you
They're
know what I
still
mean,
around, right?
right?
Yeah.
Right. But for the most part, if there's a very strong case against it, then they
Mhm.
will be out already. So
Right.
when you have major philosophical positions, major religious or non-religious or anti-religious positions, and if you conceive them as worldviews, right, then it's very difficult to figure out how to adjudicate between them,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So during my so that's my undergraduate studies. I tried to figure out that is there something that sort of underlies or something sort of that transcends these different worldviews. Then through my master's studies and my PhD down in the States, I decided to actually look into the concept of worldviews itself and what work there has been on about thinking about rationality as such,
Mhm.
um, and its relationship with worldviews. And from that, I wrote and in regard particularly with the concept of God and belief in God, right? Particularly because I was brought back into Christianity through various different factors. Much of that being philosophical, you could say, but also experiential, all of
Sure.
those things. Anyway, so I was wondering, okay, if let's sort of focus on this idea of God, people's belief in God. What can we actually say across worldviews when you have radically different way of understanding things and reasoning about things, and in a position where some reasons and evidences don't count or don't count as much, and if that's where you stand, then what do you really do? So from that question came the book titled God at the Crossroads of Worldviews, which was eventually, because there are a lot of stories behind that one too, but which was eventually published through the University of Notre Dame Press. And it was published through Notre Dame because my favorite currently living philosopher happens to be Alistair McIntyre. Yes, I know you know him because
Of
I
course,
heard you
he's
mention,
some 90-some years old now and still sharp as a tack, that fellow,
which
right?
is why I always have this like slight pause when I say currently living. I'm like, maybe I should always
Maybe I
update
should
myself
hit the
because
refresh on Google real quick.
yes, I know, right?
God help
But
him, right? Yeah.
he's
He's brilliant. He is one of my
yes,
favorites. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, it's him, Charles Taylor, who's Canadian, by the way. Hurrah! I'm
Yep.
Canada, by the way.
Got both of the books right down beside me. Taylor's realism book, also awesome book
Yeah,
as well.
Sources about himself, the secular age, and Bernard Lonergan was the one that I read into during my master's. So they're all Catholics, by the way.
They are, yeah.
Interesting. Yes.
Lonergan's insight was a huge game changer for me. It still is. I mean, I think he just solved so many issues. So that's interesting to see how we share some of the major influences there.
Right. So that is interesting because I have all of these connections with Catholicism, whereas my tradition, you could say, is sort of Protestantism. So, but anyway, so going through,
and they are different paradigms, so we can get into that a little bit too.
Yeah.
The Catholic paradigm is very different from the Protestant paradigm, which can make, unless people appreciate that, it makes conversations between Catholics and Protestants often very difficult because the paradigms are so different.
Yes, it is, but it is not as extreme, for example, as between, say,
Catholicism
scientific
and
naturalism and
naturalism,
Christianity.
right? Yeah, for sure, right.
Anyway, where was I? So, God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. Went through that with Notre Dame because Alistair McIntyre was probably the single most important influence of that book. And he published from Notre Dame. So it's like, it's meaningful if I can get it out from that. So it did come out of it. So so that was that book. The reviews for that book basically says something like this. So what that book basically does is it sort of addresses the question that I began with just earlier. You have different worldviews, and these different worldviews have different standards of reasoning and justification of like what counts as good evidence, how to weigh them, and everything.
Right.
And that applies to how people from different worldviews think about God. So take, say, a more scientific naturalist. Generally, I use people like, say, Stephen Hawking as an example. So if you have like sort of that sort of view where like you have laws of nature, that explains everything, why do you have need of God, that kind of view. And if you have a classical theist position, how do you get them to talk and make sense of each other? Right. So
yeah, that's really interesting. Can we spend a few minutes on here, Paul? Because this is obviously super fascinating. And this is something that I know this is our first time talking, so I'll just tell you a little bit of my history too, because it's relevant. Is I'm somebody who has shifted worldviews quite radically, in fact. And I didn't shift worldviews. I emphasize this a lot, coming from a sort of naturalistic background, because somebody gave me like some great argument for God's existence or Christianity. It was actually trying to spell out and find a deep intellectual satisfaction in the naturalistic worldview that it sort of imploded, right? I realized I don't think this worldview actually can be successful. And then that kind of leaves you up in the air, where then you try to kind of see what other options remain. And to be clear, I think naturalism comes in many flavors. It's like Ben and Jerry's ice cream these days. But to me, a naturalism that is at least the most meaningful and interesting, and I sort of cut my teeth on Nietzsche and the old atheists and existentialists, is a naturalist that is sort of defined by a broadly scientistic epistemology, which should constrain one's ontology, right? And that should push, I think, naturally towards a very eliminativist view on many things that I think can't be coherently eliminated. Everything from moral facts to consciousness and aboutness and all that. And to me, it seems like the only way you could kind of salvage a naturalistic worldview is you kind of inflate it with a bunch of ad hoc components that are not a natural fit in a naturalistic worldview, that it's not even meaningful anymore, right? And I wasn't willing to do that, but I see a lot of people doing that these days. And that's always, I think, a bad move in theory, comparison, and construction is, having to bring in these auxiliary components and stuff, whether you're trying to make sense of moral facts or whatever. You brought up Hawkins. I always like to think of people like Nietzsche or Alex Rosenberg, new or old, take your pick, who are willing to kind of do the eliminativist project and say, look, given how we think we come to know about reality, and given how this constrains what we're willing to allow into our ontology or metaphysics, yeah, what we should do when it comes to morality is we should be error theorists or something like that, right? And what I'm trying to get at from you, Paul, is how this complicates the debate, because sometimes people think, oh, well, to compare worldviews, you just have to go out, grab the data, and see which worldview best predicts the data. But that sort of assumes that people widely agree on the data. They don't. Oftentimes, your worldview is determining the data. It's not just the data determining the theory, right? So these things are often way more complicated than I think people let on. But all I could do is speak from my experience, where it's like, look, I was trying to work within this paradigm, this worldview. It didn't work for me. I thought it sort of reduced itself to absurdity. And there were some things that to me seemed, yeah, if a worldview can explain these things, then to hell with the worldview, as far as I'm concerned, right? And then it was through kind of exploring other worldviews. And I often say I became a classical theist and a Thomist before I became Catholic. Even entertaining Christianity when I was a naturalist, like that wasn't even on the table of options. Like I just assumed whatever the case with Christianity was from a naturalistic perspective, it just couldn't be what they said, right? But once I shifted my paradigm to a theist and a classical theist, then Christianity takes on a whole new light and becomes a lot more interesting. So sorry, I just threw a lot on the table there for you, but what you said just brought all that to mind. So pick at it however you want.
Where to begin? Well, your story is interesting because I think it illustrates at least a couple of figures. For example, Thomas Kuhn. One of the things that I wrote in the book is there's a way that we sort of structure our thinking at a grander scale. So if you're talking about something very specific, like what did I have for lunch like yesterday, or what's the result of this particular experiment in a very in this particular field of science, that's very specific, and I mean, it's very difficult to have disagreement over those things, right? Whereas, oh yeah. So, but when you get into a much more comprehensive viewpoint, like a grand theory about the cosmos, or even larger, where you get metaphysical, so to speak, at a level of worldview, then what seems to take place is that you have a framework, right? You settle on a framework where you interpret data. So one of the things that people tend to miss is people may ask, if you're rational and if you have generally speaking, if you accept science, like don't you believe in the same thing? Don't you have the same data? Well, in the sense that you accept like scientific findings, yes. But what people then miss is that if for you to then like gather together all of these different scientific findings about, say, the Big Bang theory or the theory of evolution and all of that, if you want to put it together, then what you may call philosophy, like it just barges in, because if you just put scientific facts together, like line them up, then you can't make an intelligible understanding of the world from those alone. It's what's the specific term? Your position is underdetermined by data. That's the one. So you may have the same data, but that data alone is not going to give you a substantial enough position on things like what does it mean to live, or what is reality, and what's it composed of, and how is it really structured. Or if you want to just put it in, there's an entire section of it in the chapter where I say, okay, let's say you just have like scientific facts. You can't have scientific facts, by the way, because fact, for example, it's um, the etymology behind it is something like to build. So you can think of scientific facts as bricks. If you have pile of bricks, you just have a pile of bricks. You have to put them together into a house. So if you just line everything up with scientific facts, you have questions like, okay, so you have with scientists, you search for, say, you search for laws of nature. What do the laws of nature like? What are they actually like? Are they real? How are they related? If they're real, what do you mean by real? If they exist, like what do you mean by existence? Or you have different scientific fields. How are they related together? Not in the historical sense of like how have they actually interacted, but things like, say, what's the example that I gave? Cognitive neuroscience, right? And uh, cognitive neuroscience and cognitive science, they look at the same thing from a different angle, right? One looks at it like physically, like what is your brain doing, whereas the other one thinks of it more in, what's a good analogy, software-ish kind of. That's always you have to watch out for analogy, but it's more of a software kind of thing, like what happens internally, like thinking wise. Are we talking about the same thing? Because we describe them very differently, but we are going through the same phenomenon. How are they related, and what does it mean by that? And you can't determine that simply by scientific facts. It's there's a framework within which you fit them, right? So in that sense, if you have a different framework, you can have the same data but come up with widely different conclusions at the widest, more comprehensive level, right? Going back to your story, what's interesting that I wanted to talk about is that it sort of it sort of goes through some of the things that, say, T.S. Kuhn, who wrote the Structures of Scientific Revolution, and really popularized the very term paradigm right there. He mentioned that, like, you stick with the paradigm when it works. That's how it works. Like, historically speaking, science works when the paradigm, sort of the frame works. And but the thing is, there could be some errors, right? So you have a Newtonian paradigm, but some orbits of some planets don't quite work the same way, right? It doesn't follow the exact same prediction. So if you don't really think about it, we may say, well, does that disprove Newtonian theory? And the answer is no, because if you have a paradigm, if it's something like a framework in which you interpret data, you can't just get rid of that, because then you don't know what you will be seeing anymore. So you need another paradigm ready to go if you're going to abandon one, because if you abandon it without another paradigm, then you can't see anything. You can't like, you don't know what you can actually think. So you need a paradigm ready to go. That's one thing to do. But secondly, you better have a lot of reasons for you to abandon that paradigm. So it's cumulative. It has to build up. Kuhn calls it a crisis. So hey, the planet doesn't sort of move in the exact same way that Newton, for example, predicted that it would, at least in that paradigm. Then one of the things that you could do is, well, maybe I'm measuring it wrong, or the instrument is wrong. That's usually the go-to answer. But if there's nothing wrong with that, then you can add some new hypothesis, like, hey, maybe there's a planet that we don't know about. And that's how, for example, Neptune apparently was discovered. There's another planet that's affecting its gravity is affecting that orbit. So it is only when whole bunch of things keep coming up that sort of goes against the paradigm that you say, maybe we need to look for a new paradigm. And that's a difficult thing to do. But in your story, you basically reach that point where you accept like all of these scientific accounts of everything, but if you put them together and if you add these non-scientific yet rational, like philosophical sort of understanding to framework to like fit all of these things in, um, things get really, really clunky. Like consciousness alone might be slightly clunky, but then you have morality, then you have all of these, and then you throw in Nietzsche's devastating critique, like, do you actually need morality? Why not go? Nihilism is a thing that's there, and you need to answer that. Then, so the clunkiness becomes so unbearable that you decide to look for another paradigm. In our context, is you decide to look for another worldview. So the motivation is the paradigm or the worldview, that framework. Is it, can you still use it to figure out the world around you, or is the motivation to leave it for another paradigm big enough? There's that motivational factor that's in your story, but at the same time, it also speaks of like how these things, how this sort of thinking process works. There's a framework. You have to have a framework, one or the other, and you're not simply accumulating data. You are fitting data like a puzzle with different frameworks in mind.
That's right.
And then the question is, what if, so for in your case, your particular framework reached the crisis point, as Kuhn puts it. So you had to move it. But what happens when that framework that you had is malleable and flexible enough that you could sort of mold and perhaps not because no framework is perfect, because we are humans, and we don't have perfect knowledge, so that's how it is. But
Right.
maybe can fit it sort of adequately enough that you can live with it, right? But then there's another sort of framework that and they people who hold that can live with it. If you have those two framework, what do you do with that? Like,
Right.
because we are talking about the same thing, but one says there is God and one says there's no God, and you can work with your framework sort of. There's some clunkiness to it, but sure. They can work with their framework. There's some clunkiness, like evil. What do you do with that when you believe in God and God is good? So that sort of clunkiness. How do you? Which one's right? Right. So that's a question that again my book was trying to sort of again get at, and the answer to that is, well, you can't do it by simply having like this universal neutral rational standpoint. There are some, you could say, sort of neutral sort of set of facts that you can draw upon, possibly. Rules of logic, for example, it's pretty much.
I know some people even deny that, right? So
yes, right. So this is why I'm sort of throwing those out as like a possible candidates, right?
Right.
So rules of logic might work, at least like really, really fundamental ones, hopefully, right? But again, the problem then becomes underdeterminism. Sure, you can use it, hopefully, for most worldviews, but it's not sufficient to tell us which view is true, sort of.
Right. Right.
So then, what's the alternative? Well, Alistair McIntyre's is because the issue actually rose, in a sense, from philosophy of science in this, or at least the answer that McIntyre had rose from philosophy of science, because you have Kuhn saying, well, we thought sciences were like the gold standard of like neutral rationality, and in a way it is. I mean, it's very understandable to think so, but sciences go through paradigms, and paradigm switches. When a paradigm switches from one to the other, there is no like absolute neutral standard that determines why you go from, say, Ptolemaic paradigm of astronomy to Copernican to, say, Einsteinian. There's you have sort of a guideline of which explains like data better, which one's more comprehensive, which one sort of fits with all the other known facts outside your field, all of those. But these are guidelines. They're not algorithm. You can't just calculate which one has a higher sort of numerical score on the truth scale. Then the question then became, okay, if that's the case, then is science rational? Because we can't explain why one paradigm switches to the other. There's no absolute rules for it. So McIntyre's answer was that you need to think about it in terms of a narrative. So if you actually read the history of science, and sort of Kuhn noted that too, because Kuhn says whenever there's a new paradigm, they rewrite history, and like that. In one way, that's bad.
And it's usually because a bunch of people died, right?
Yeah, so a bunch of people died, and
Right.
and you have a new paradigm, and the new paradigm has their story, right? And it's the story of the winner saying, well, this is why the old paradigm was wrong, and this is why paradigm is so much better. Or even more, I think for Kuhn it's more like, this is what science, or say physics, was really about, and this is all the mistakes that they made, but they were actually trying to reach us. Whereas Kuhn was actually pointing out that's not how the old, like, people who did physics before that paradigm would have seen, understood what they were doing. So they're actually misrepresenting what people were doing historically. But at the same time, McIntyre's point was, if one paradigm is able to explain the story of the previous or the other paradigm, not only why they were wrong, but why they would have thought they were right, all of the good reasons why they thought were right, and why they ran into trouble on their own terms. So, for
Right.
example,
It can predict problems for the other paradigm from one paradigm. Right.
Or at least explain the problems, and the problems that the people in that paradigm saw already. So, for example, in the Ptolemaic paradigm, they were like, why are these orbits and the calculation, why are they so darn complicated? Like, we have to add all of these epicycles more and more, and it is becoming like unbearable, right? So that's actually a problem. Now, if you just see it simply in terms of like paradigm side by side, then you have the Copernican paradigm, which is simpler, but it didn't explain some of the other stuff that Ptolemaic paradigm would have. But what eventually happened was that, well, here were all of the problems that the people from the Ptolemaic paradigm acknowledge as their problems, right? We were able to resolve them this way, but all of the things that were going right for the Ptolemaic paradigm, we were able to integrate it into our system too. Whereas the Ptolemaic paradigm cannot do the reverse, or if they can't do the reverse, then the new paradigm justifies itself, and that is why historically paradigm is able to shift. So what the people who were getting confused about, like, how is science rational and all of that, what they were being confused about was that rationality is historical in that sense. You have the way that you define whether your position is rational always have to reference back to the entire historical journey, so to speak, of the inquiry, of what are you actually trying to do in the inquiry. For example, what's your goal? And that goal is never like completely like perfectly understood. It's always sort of vague. You're always working toward it, but you have some idea of it, so that you have an idea of whether, like, are we actually approaching the goal? Are we stuck? That's how you understand what you're doing in the intellectual inquiry. You have that goal, a telos, so to speak, and once you have that, you can tell the story of that progress toward that partially understood goal. And if you can tell, your rationality is dependent on how your previous journey was enable you to overcome all of these different problems and trials to progress toward that goal, and perhaps give you a better understanding of that goal, and all of the problems that you had, and all of the achievements that you had. All of that goes into your rationality. So again, paradigm, competing paradigms, one wins out if one paradigm has a more substantial story that is able to include the lesser paradigm, so to speak, or the defeated paradigm. So you apply that, and this is also McIntyre sort of did that as well. You apply that to rival competing worldviews that are now side by side. So because in Kuhnian paradigm you have paradigms that come sequentially, whereas our problem is that you have frameworks that are side by side, and
that's right.
They're together. So then the question is, is it possible to have a narrative that, in a sense, makes your rival paradigm your predecessor, right? Just like, say, Newtonian paradigms is able to make, say, Copernican and Ptolemaic sort of paradigm their predecessors, and sort of show a progress from that position to the Newtonian paradigm, then say to Einsteinian, whatever. Can you do that with your rival paradigm? Perhaps, perhaps not. But that's one way of being able to go across paradigms. So if that's the case, where do we go from here? Right. So if you want to do that, what you then need to do is that you can't simply say, well, your paradigm, well, in this case, your worldview is wrong because of this and this and reason, because you can't say that unless you are in that worldview. You can you think in their terms, you argue and um, and work by their standard of reasoning.
You have to try and put that lens on. Right?
Yes.
You have to try and step into it and see through it, right?
And the problems that you list for that worldview needs to be a problem that worldview recognizes as its own, right? They may not think those problems to be sufficient enough that they're in a crisis, because obviously if they're in a crisis, they would have jumped ship already. But enough that they're like, this is a problem and you don't know what to deal with it. So you need to figure out what those problems are, but you also need to figure out why people that hold that framework, that worldview, believe what they believe, and all of the good reasons for it. So if you become a native inhabitant, a native, one way of putting it would be a language. If you become a native speaker of that worldview, as well as a native speaker, so you are bilingual in that sense, then you can see the journey, because remember, McIntyre pointed out that rationality of any worldview is very tightly bound up with a narrative of the history of that worldview, right?
You're right.
So if you can tell that story and tell it as well as that as a native can, and you can tell the story of your own worldview, of your first worldview, sort of like a native, and you can bring them together so that stuff that, like the conceptual resources, the kind of reasoning and thinking and the perhaps people can resolve the problems in the other worldview that the other worldview recognizes as their own, and also explain why all of the things that that worldview has achieved were able to be achieved. And if you can tell that story and integrate it into your own, then your worldview sort of wins.
Yes, right.
Now, what's interesting then is, and I guess this sort of connects with some of your, I guess, people that you've read, especially Aquinas, for example. So McIntyre, he's a fascinating character because he's an atheist. He was an atheist. It was a pretty
he went through a big worldview shift, McIntyre, right?
And he was a significant figure. Not as significant as, say, Anthony Flew, I would say. But it's interesting because they wrote a book on atheism together, right? Anthony Flew,
and they both shifted towards theism. McIntyre became Catholic. I think Flew just became like a general theist. I don't think.
Yeah, he became sort of a deism. Unfortunately, because along with, say, J.L. Mackie, Anthony Flew for me was like the most respectable sort of atheist positions among the analytical philosophy, like that's school of thought. So his argument for the presumption of atheism and I forgot the article. It's the one where falsification of theology.
That's right.
I think were probably the most, for me, I think they pose the greatest sort of fundamental challenge toward the theological sort of understanding of the world, or a theistic understanding of the world. And in a sense, my book is a very, very extended argument against Flew's presumption of atheism, right? Because his point is that you start from atheism,
right?
Whereas my position is that that's impossible.
Yeah, like it's also unreasonable for many other reasons. I've come to. I remember when I first encountered that too, and I thought it was very intriguing. But I now think it's just totally wrong for many reasons. But
well, actually, I need to sort of elaborate on that. It's not impossible in the sense that no one can do it. I mean, it's if you want to do that as a sort of like a universal sort of default position, then it's incoherent. what's actually happening is that you start from whichever worldview that you start on. So when you have a theistic argument, like this is why we believe that, say, God is, then you, at least in the contemporary setting, because our theistic arguments have been used for various purposes throughout history, but at least in the contemporary setting, you are making the argument to people who don't believe in God. Hence why you're making the argument. So in that sense, you start from atheism because you are you're starting from a worldview and you are trying to jump worldview. And the worldview that you're jumping
if you're trying to get somebody to change their mind, then of course you have the burden of proof at that point, right?
So
but normally, like as a totally neutral position, you don't want the burden of proof, because that's a hard thing for anybody to sustain, right? It's always easier to pick at a position than it is to build it up. So generally, the threat of what Flu's doing there is, and I think that theists can sustain the burden of proof with a lot of work, but generally better if you don't have to have it by default to begin with, right?
Right. So the difference between what he would say and what I would argue is that if a theistic argument fails, for example, and Graham Opie, for example, arguing about God's list many different reasons why you can't do that, because there's so many sort of assumptions that go into various concepts and ideas that make up any of these arguments, which can be questioned. So he's saying it's in a sense it's unfair. It's almost impossible to have an argument that is substantial enough that is able to bring about a belief revision. I believe that's what he calls it.
Reasonable belief revision, right?
Another worldview, but that doesn't mean that the people who failed in that argument ultimately failed in the argument is being irrational. It means that that's just how the challenge is. And what I would have then added was that if a theistic argument fails, what that actually means is that it fails to provide sufficient enough reason to undermine your rival worldview. That's what it's doing. But it's not what the implication of Flu's position is, that if a theistic argument fails, then theism itself fails. Whereas that's not
right.
What
you just sit in atheism, right?
Right. What's happening is that the jump was a failure, but the launching pad is still there, so to speak, right? So you still have that stalemate, so to speak. That's what's at stake. So that's actually my position. That was a bit of a digression.
That's good. That was, well, you're bringing up Aquinas, and I think we were going to get into the idea of him being a system builder. And I think I'm going to anticipate probably we're going to go with this, and I agree with it. Sometimes people look at his 5 ways and they think they're meant to be total demonstrations in and of themselves that should convince a Graham Oppie to believe in God or something like that. And that's totally out of context, right? They're sort of mere summaries that assume a lot of background knowledge for beginner theology students, right? And he does argue for length at God in many other places. But if you go to his De Ente et Essentia, where I think you get a very powerful demonstration of God, at least it convinced me and still does convince me, that it is embedded within a very deep metaphysical framework. He is carving reality at its joints, right? And he's got all these other commitments that Thomas is known for. Talk about paradigms. He's he's a big tent Platonist, right? He's anti-nominalistic, anti-skeptical, anti-mechanistic. He thinks forms are explanatory entities. All that stuff, right, is going into that. And if you see the world the way you see reality the way Thomas does, then I think you slide into classical theism pretty quickly and inevitably. But what people don't appreciate is all that background metaphysical machinery that's at work. And I think it's brilliant, but it's not the sort of thing that you can get on the table in a 5-minute conversation and hope to impress somebody who's in an entirely different paradigm, right?
It's like learning a completely different language, right? So I'm more or less fluent in Korean and English. So I can appreciate the massive difference between the two languages. And there is a massive difference.
Right.
So if you try to jump from one language to another language, one of the biggest challenges is like, do I really need to learn all of that? And the answer is yes, you really
yes. Same if you want
to
learn a musical instrument, right? Do I really have to learn all of that? Yes, you do, right?
But then what comes into play is that, well, my worldview seems to be working pretty fine for me to like. So I don't have enough of a motivation to go through that much of an effort to understand what essentially is an alien language, really. But anyway, Aquinas. So it's actually a pretty good segue from Flew to Aquinas, because when Flew was making the point about presumption of atheism, he used Aquinas as a paradigm example. That what Aquinas was doing was that, as you said, he was giving us proofs. The 5 ways is simply a proof. But then you have a lot of problem, because Summa Theologiae, if you look at it, it's a like massive set of tomes. There are a lot of stuff that he wrote there. And the 5 ways is like half a page out of like thousands of pages. So you might wonder, it's like, why is he writing a half a page, where most philosophers of religion, at least in the English-speaking world, when they talk about God, they just talk about the 5 ways as if they're like separate from the rest, which, as you just mentioned, you can't do that. Then what's actually going on? Well, the answer is pretty interesting in that what Aquinas was doing is more than simply system building. He's bringing 2 incommensurable frameworks together, what was considered to be
synthesizing, right? Yeah.
And in that context, I think you mentioned him as a Platonist, right?
Big tent Platonist, and I would put Aristotle under that tent as well.
Right. Okay. So what was happening there then? I think you had. I listened to one conversation that you had with. His name was Gavin Kerr.
Gavin Kerr, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. He's not related to Fergus Kerr, is he?
Not that I know of. But...
Okay, because Fergus Kerr was one Aquinas scholar that I used quite a bit when I was writing the book. Anyway, so. And he would also agree that you need to look at the wider sort of theology for you to understand the 5 ways. Anyway, the background setting was that you have Aristotelianism and their natural philosophy, and it's taking over what's called the faculty of arts. So the way that people saw the world, nature, politics, everything else, it was switching from old school, like well, not old, that might cause confusion. Platonism that people Western Christianity used in those days, and they
from Augustine down, right?
Yeah. So really Augustinian version of Neoplatonism, you could say, and they were switching over to Aristotelianism. Theology, however, which sort of sat at the top in that hierarchy of sciences, really remained Augustinian. So then you have a problem, because Aquinas, as a theologian, is a Neoplatonist, you could say, or Augustinian to be more specific. And when people thought about the world, really, people thought it in terms of Aristotelianism. So in a way, it's very similar to some of the difficulties that we have for Christianity today, where theology, Christian theology, but then you have all of these sciences which are not known as part of Christianity. So what do you do with that when things seem to like radically diverge? Well, Aquinas is a fascinating character for people who are interested in the question of like competing worldviews, because Aquinas apparently did something that is supposed to be and apparently impossible, which was to bring 2 rival worldviews with different set of like reasoning standard, and he made it into a single worldview. And what's even more fascinating, and I think if you listen to my interview with Dr. Paul Giesting, I mentioned this. Bertrand Russell, for example, he has this book called History of Western Philosophy. I don't remember the exact title, but it's pretty much something like it. So Bertrand Russell, for those people who's interested in philosophy would know him already, right? But anyway,
of course,
logical atomism. He had 20th century, fairly brilliant guy, right? He also wrote Principia Mathematica,
right?
But when he wrote about the history of modern philosophy, he was pretty friendly with Augustine, for example. He's like, Augustine seems like a pretty great philosopher, but he had terrible things to say about Aquinas. Like, I don't consider him I don't consider him a philosopher, right? So you know, and he has a book like literally titled "Why I'm Not a Christian," right?
Yeah.
Right. So he's a hostile reader, but what he says about Aquinas is that, but he's able to, um, he is a great Aristotelian. He's able to like make arguments. He's very faithful to the Aristotelian corpus. He understands them well. He understands all of the issues well. It's just like he doesn't do anything new, and he has this like Christian position that he doesn't deviate from. But he's also an Aristotelian, and so that's why he's I don't consider him a philosopher. But for people who's interested in the problem of like if you have rival worldviews, you just they just don't match. Like we don't know what to do with them. If that's the actual problem, and Russell wouldn't have been aware of that problem because he works with a paradigm like there's a universal reason. If you just follow my logical atomism, everything works out.
Right.
But then logical
spoiler alert, it didn't, right?
Yeah, logical positivism like fails
Right.
big time in the mid 20th century, and that's completely abandoned. Some people might argue that we went into the other extreme with at least certain versions of postmodernism, where like maybe there is no such thing as truth at all. That sort of extreme, but at least with Russell, it's like he's like, what's the problem? But for people who's worried about these worldviews, Russell actually acknowledges explicitly that these Aristotelianism and Christianity was completely and very seamlessly integrated in Aquinas, which is supposed to be impossible, as I said. So how do you do that? Well, McIntyre points out that he's a native speaker for Aristotelianism and Augustinianism.
Mhm.
And I think Gavin mentioned that he's more of a Platonist, right? And in a sense, he is, because he's from the Department of Theology, which is Augustinian, right? That's where his root is. But then he integrates the Aristotelian reasoning into his system, so that if you read the very first question of the Summa Theologia, he like transforms the understanding of like intellectual inquiry, in which he places theology at the top, and he makes them into Aristotelian sciences, right? And right after that, he goes over the 3 different articles in the second question, which is about the existence of God, where the 5 ways situated. Where the 5 ways is situated. And what my argument was that, and I use other Aquinas scholars, and they point out that 5 ways are not. I mean, you have something that's like distinctly Aquinas in his later arguments. This is true with, say, Summa Contra Gentiles, whereas the argument from, say, Motion, the first cause, like that deals with like, does God exist, is pretty much a variation of the arguments that exist already in the Aristotelian tradition, in the Platonic tradition. It's we can find precedents for them already. So what that means is that what Aquinas was doing isn't sort of presenting like these brand new, especially how we do it these days. What's a good example? Swinburne. He's probably the most, I would say, the most prominent example of sort of a contemporary arguments for the existence of God.
Yes,
And
right.
if you read him, it is pretty impressive. Like, he makes this cumulative case. I would say the paradigmatic example of a good philosophical debate between, say, the generally scientific naturalist atheist position and a theist position in a contemporary setting would have been Swinburne versus J.L. Mackie, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So Miracle of Theism is basically a response against Swinburne. Swinburne has a sort of response, you could say, I would say, in arguments in a book called Is There God? Is There God? Where you find out, and this is one of my arguments, that they actually work with a different standard. They place weight in a different way. So for Swinburne,
And not only that, but another thing, if we focus on Mackie's Miracle of Theism, one of the biggest critiques against that, which is another consideration to throw into the debate, came from Alvin Plantinga, where Mackie is talking about being rational, but never gives an account of rationality, right? And if you follow Plantinga's account of rationality, that's going to give you a whole different way of how you're going to assess Mackie's arguments, or even Oppie's, right? Because it might be the case that you might reject an argument for God, but it might be a doxastic perversity to do so, right? If Flanagan's right. So one of the other problems in these debates is we have to get some sort of account of rationality on the table. And a lot of people don't even bother to do that. Was Flanagan's big critique of Mackey's. Like, he's put this whole book together about being rational. He never even tells us exactly what that means, right?
And Plantinga, especially so he belongs in a movement called Reform Epistemologists.
That's right.
For those of you,
and to be clear, I'm not saying Plantinga's account is right. Maybe it is. Maybe that's a different debate.
Yeah.
But it just shows again of the different ways you could enter into this sort of worldview comparison project and how complicated it is, right?
Yes, and Plantinga is, I think, his argument about moral ontological argument, what's called the moral ontological argument, with all these possible, there are all these possible world, and God is necessary in being in all of it. Again, simplification. And his argument, I think it was him that did it. He makes a very good argument that sort of knocks out the stronger argument from evil, which is like it's a logical contradiction,
right?
That there's an evil. If there is evil, then God can.
And he's in that mix with Mackey, and there's
So he cuts those, but what's more interesting about Plantinga for in our context is that his sort of reform epistemologist position is a very blatant and powerful example of how different you can be with a different sort of a understanding of what rationality entails, right? So if you have a reform epistemologist position about theism, and you look at like what's warranted in that position and what's not, then you try to compare that with, say, J.L. Mackie. You can't, because their standard is so different that anything that works with Plantinga just doesn't really make sense with J.L. Mackie, and vice versa. So that's in a sense, that movement sort of highlights the kind of problem that arguing across worldviews can sort of pose for us. And you're going back to, where was I with Aquinas?
Well, we started with saying how one of Swinburne's responses was the different standard, and I just brought in Plantinga to highlight how different things can actually get, right? Yeah,
right. So
swing us in whatever direction you want from here.
So Swinburne, going back to Swinburne, the reason, I remember why I brought us Swinburne. So his argument begins with something like this. Here is like a substantial sort of description of the concept of God. All of the traits are ready to go. And then he makes an argument, a cumulative argument from various different aspects, like from the existence of the universe, consciousness, morality, and all of that. He makes a sort of a cumulative case for this very, very specifically defined being. Right.
And he sort of treats it, the way that he does it is he sort of more or less treats it as a hypothesis, right? He sort of shapes his hypothesis, so argues that it's a very simple hypothesis, and say, look at all the data that it predicts, right?
And then, and the meaning of the word simple differs radically with Swinburne, with Mackey, right? Because with Mackey, simple means like, don't add more beings, right?
Then you have to. It's sort of like how many things you got in your ontology. Versus, that's another part of the debate. Like, not only what, I guess, notion of simplicity are we using here? Conceptual, ideological, ontological, theoretical, all the above, right? Which one's more important? And then, like, which level, right? Is it like just however bloated your ontology, like if you just have one more person versus, or is it on the fundamental level that simplicity matters the most, right? Should we take Occam's razor or Schaffer's, Occam's razor or Schaffer's laser, right? There's like so many complications in these
and I mean,
debates, right?
To be fair to Swinburne, he's basically saying, well, I am adding one more being, but by adding one more being, your explanation gets concentrated in this one being, rather than
you unify and simplify on the fundamental level. So, and to give Swinburne credit, he's got a fair amount of work defending his notion of simplicity too. He's got that Marquette lecture, which I thought was actually quite good.
But at the same time, if you compare that with what Aquinas is doing, it's very different, because Aquinas doesn't, like, he says, he says it right out, like, we can't know the essence of God, like, from a human standpoint. So
he would also take huge issue with how Swinburne conceives of God as well.
Yes. So he, like, the starting point is very different. He doesn't begin with a fully sort of established concept of God and then try to prove him. He actually begins with you could say it this way. Well, in your sort of intellectual tradition or worldview, how we put it today, in your worldview, uh, the way that you sort of reason things out, and I'm trying to sort of summarize a very like 2 chapters worth of stuff into a single sentence. Can I actually do it? Um, okay, so what he does with what he does is that, say, in the Aristotelian tradition, which again, remember, is at the time of Aquinas, is a competing worldview from where he is. So it's supposed to, like, they're not supposed to mesh. But he's saying, okay, look, because Plato, and this is where your talk about Aristotle being included in the Big Ten Platonism comes from. Both from Plato, because Aristotle is in a sense an heir to Plato, and he is trying to sort of extend the kind of questions and issues that Plato began with, which is, what is an intellectual inquiry? How do you get the truth, right? And Plato sort of answers by, well, there is a goal, which he calls it the forms in that sense. And there is like these principles and patterns, and another way to put it, to reality, to which we are trying to understand, and they are real. And in that sense, Aristotle doesn't, like, he doesn't disagree with that. What he disagree in a sense is how to get to it. So, and in a sense, Aristotle has a more substantial understanding, at least. That's what the people in the days of Thomas Aquinas thought, because that's why they were moving over, at least in the area of natural philosophy, to Aristotelianism. But Aquinas was then pointing out that, well, there is an underlying sort of understanding of like where we are trying to get to ultimately in our intellectual inquiry. Aristotle has it, Plato has it. We are approaching it from a different angle, but we both have it. And if you get to that ultimate point of inquiry of every science that we can know, and if all of those sciences reach a complete and perfect understanding, which we don't have and which we may never reach, right? But it will be something like the first principles of everything from which we can understand everything. And we have to believe that there are these first principles. There are these things at the end, because otherwise, what are you doing, right? Like, if you don't have a goal, you don't have a direction, you can't navigate where your intellectual inquiry is without that conception, right? So conception of if you follow the chain, if you follow the way the world changes, all of the phenomenon and all of the process of the cosmos, if you follow it back to its roots, because that's what we are doing in every intellectual inquiry that natural philosophy is doing, for example, in Aristotelian and Platonism. If you follow the chain of, say, efficient causes, or if you understand that there are like transcendentals, all of those things, that's part and parcel of both Aristotelian and Platonic intellectual inquiry. You can't do without it. It's like fundamental it's not even a it's like a fundamental parameters, right? So you agree, like Aristotelians agree, we agree, we call that God, which is interesting, because one of the things I noticed when I first read the Five Ways is that the phrasing is very, like, it's very odd, because Aquinas doesn't say therefore God exists. He says there's this, and we call that God.
That's the thing, right? Yeah.
Or then, and he does it in a 5 different, like, he has 5 different phrases of it, which basically, again, it's like, we call that God, we name that as God, we understand that as God. Like, is it just is it just his style of writing? And the answer is no. He's actually identifying fundamental features of the rival and his own worldview, and he's saying, I'm not proving God, I'm identifying God in the reality that we perceive and in our intellectual inquiry and in our lives. But that God, at this point, we can only call that God because we haven't done the work, the metaphysical work that you put in, that should follow, that gets us into, for example, divine simplicity and all of those things. That remains, which is why the Five Ways is 1 page and is followed by thousands of pages
turn
after,
the page, friends,
right?
Yeah.
And that's where the system building comes from. But the system building where what I would emphasize is that the system building comes by bringing two different worldviews together, and the crossing point of those two worldviews is God,
Right.
right?
Right. Yes.
And that's why the title of my book is God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. If you bring together rival worldviews and whatever that is at the most fundamental level of both worldviews, because again, remember, there is no like universal sort of standpoint that works with every worldview, every like conceivable, not even rules of logic, as you pointed out, because there are some views like there is no such thing as logic, right? So it only works with particular crossroads of particular worldviews. But if you get those particular worldviews together into a crossroad and something that is fundamental to how people sort of interact with reality, so to speak, right?
Yes.
That's God. That's at least that's what Aquinas is doing. So we call that God, but at this point we can only call that God because then we need to make the rest of the journey together by sort of conversing in dialectics and dialogues, you could say, or simply, and build something from that crossroad into something more substantial about like how do we live, how do we understand everything, what does this scientific discovery and that scientific discovery mean, what about this metaphysical issue with that metaphysical, so we build it together, but we need that starting point. And because we never, so when say discussions about God don't actually get anywhere, which is like almost always the case when people debate about God. They just seem to talk past each other. It's like, and they oftentimes they have like extraordinarily different conceptions of God.
But yes, right.
Right. And the reason why it doesn't get anywhere is because people don't bother making that crossroad. And
Right.
it is only when you make that crossroad and then figure out, okay, this is what we mean by God. Then the question then becomes, okay, if we paint out the portrait of reality, so to speak, from this crossroad, what would that portrait look like? And if the portrait becomes something, and we would expect the portrait to become something somewhat dissimilar to, say, the Christian conception of God that as we have them now, because we don't have perfect knowledge, and say how the atheists understood, or that particular brand of atheists understood that reality. You would expect something that's at least somewhat different. But in an ideal setting, when the two positions dialogue with each other, the resources of both sides are going to make something better and perhaps progress us further in that journey than we were before. That's the ideal.
Yeah.
That's what Aquinas accomplished, and that is what I'm hoping we are able to accomplish if we rework what it means to have a debate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love this perspective. And I like that, obviously I'm a fan of Aquinas, so it's cool to see that he's a model for you, but in a way that maybe a lot of people haven't come to appreciate Aquinas for. I mean, Aquinas is appreciated for a lot of things. And if you've spent a lot of time with Aquinas, you will, I think, especially if you've also spent a lot of time with the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions, you will be quite amazed at how he was able to marry those things and how he was, despite what Bertrand Russell said, he did a lot of new things, a lot of new things. I mean, if you just try to get your head around exactly how he tries to solve the problem of universals, it's clear that he's not thinking about it in exactly the same way as Aristotle or Plato. For gentle listeners, I would commend an article by Jeffrey Brower on this from Purdue, Aquinas and the Problem of Universals. I think that's one of the better ones out there for really understanding what Aquinas is up to. But I think it will showcase what you're talking about, Paul, of how he really was able to bring these worldviews into conversation. I think use the best resources of each and fashion something that, to me, I the way I like to think about Aquinas, maybe this is a little bit too romantic, is sometimes people say, well, he's the first great medieval philosopher, but I've also heard it said that he's the last great classical philosopher. He's sort of the completion of Big Tent Platonism, in a sense, the one that kind of brought it all together. It's a romantic way of thinking about it, I suppose. Or you could go with Lloyd Gerson. Lloyd Gerson's got a really interesting proposal because he thinks that a lot of the problems of modern philosophy are trying to make too many concessions of marrying paradigms that are fundamentally incompatible. So he's got a fairly recent book that I think is great on this theme. It's Platonism versus naturalism. And of
Mm.
course, he would classify Aquinas, and that's who I'm borrowing from here is, Gerset. He's like, yeah, Aquinas, if you understand what I mean by Platonism, Aristotle, all those guys are Platonists, right? And the problem is a lot of people have tried to play a little too friendly with Platonism or naturalism. You get all these crazy, paradigms that just never work out. Why is that? And he thinks that's part of the problem. If you want philosophy, you actually need to be a Platonist. It's a very provocative book, but I think a very good one and relates to a lot of the themes that you're talking about here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if you want to be, at least, if you want to have some version of a realist position about anything, uh, uh, some strand or some theme of Platonism and Aristotelianism, this is how I would put it. It's just going to sneak back in because let's use. I think I mentioned Stephen Hawking before. Let's use Stephen Hawking.
Sure.
Because I think his argument, because he's not a philosopher, obviously. He's doing this completely as a physicist, and he's sort of venturing into area that really isn't his.
Isn't his specialty, right? Mm-hmm.
Right. But he does this very loose way of like talking about issues about God. But he puts it this way: like, if we have ultimate laws of physics, if we know and if we know how these ultimate laws of physics can generate the cosmos, or in this case, multiple versions of the universe, right? And I think his book on grand design sort of imply that there's a multiverse, but it's not really a like I don't really like that term, because multiverse means that it's simply separate, but it's not purely separate, because they have the same, at least according to how Hawking would put it, it would have the same ultimate fundamental laws of the universe, laws of nature that would sort of generate different universes with different variations of those laws. You could say with different numbers, different constants, you could say. Anyway, but they all connect. Anyway, Hawking basically say, like, if you have that understanding, that you don't need God. But then do you understand? Then the question then becomes like, what do you mean by God? That when you have that, you don't need God anymore, because.
And what do you mean by explanation? What do you mean by cause? All these different things, right? Can we terminate explanations? Just etiologically, for example, and with the laws of nature?
We don't even need to get like that technical about in terms of metaphysics, because that question in itself basically raises the problem of like, what's your conception of laws of, because some people may say laws of nature is too Platonic. There are arguments that like we don't laws.
Yeah, just be an extreme realist about it, right?
Yeah, it's why would you say they are real? Why can't we say they're? But how can you say that they are not real? Like, can you be a you can, I suppose, but you have this strong tendency, if you're a scientist, that if you will talk about laws of nature are real. They are, and especially if you say something like how Hawking would say, laws of nature generates universes, right? Because then what you're putting on is, at least logically, is prior. But then the point is, well, the way that you put it, laws of nature, they have, as far as I can tell, they connected they're sort of they have direct continuity with the Greek philosophical conception of the logos, and logos, which goes into ideas like the forms, Platonic forms, and all of that. It just has a direct sort of line from it. So whenever you talk about the laws of nature being real, and that it can bring about things, right, tangible things, then you're skirting with Platonism, or at least one version of Platonism. But as soon as you do that, then you bring about you raise the question of the divine mind, right? So that's where I was going. If you say you want to make a crossroad, and in that sense, I sort of not depart. I have a different focus. I have a different focus in how you sort of apply Aquinas. Because when people talk, when Aquinas scholars go over Aquinas, or Thomas go over Aquinas, they focus on the content, which is understandable, because it is a very impressive. Even Russell points that out. It's like it's a impressive sort of a system. It's very it's massive, it's intricate, and all of that. So understandable that you want to focus on the content, whereas my focus is on what did he achieve, right? So rather than what did he argue for, but he was able to bring two worldviews together and make a system out of it. That's what he achieved. Then the question of then the question then diverges, because if you're focused on the content, then what you're going to be asking for in contemporary setting is that, can we apply his precise argument and metaphysics and make a case that that is intelligible today, which is a very complicated question. My question more is, can we do something very similar that Aquinas did today? Can we make a sort of a crossroad in a very sort of general and, unfortunately at this point, vague, but theism or Christianity, to be more slightly more specific? And can you make a crossroad from that with, say, something, because you want to be fairly specific, say scientific naturalism? If you do that, where would the crossroad be? And the God at the Crossroads of Worldviews ends with the section where it's interesting that people like Stephen, so atheist scientist, and the brief history of
Time.
I forgot the name. Yes, like brief history of the universe. No, that doesn't sound right. Brief history of time is pretty much a Bible, right, for a scientific naturalist, and it's McIntyre would have a lot to say about that with the role of core text in the tradition. But anyway, so Hawking would be a great example, and it's interesting that he conceives of laws of nature as generating the universe, because the features of the laws of nature, which has direct link to the concepts like the logos and Platonic forms, makes or shows that this is something that Aquinas would call God in a scientific naturalist worldviews. They would say, no, it is, and no, it isn't. But then what we would be saying is that, well, if you conceive of God as like this entity that's particularly powerful and particularly knowledgeable, but I think it's David Bentley Hart that he's the most recent and famous example of it, that he writes in a book.
Experience of God.
Yes, that's the one. And I found out about this book a bit later, so I'm like, that's the sort of argument that I wanted to sort of present. But anyway, so he's like saying, well, you got that all wrong, because God is not a being among other beings that have unique qualities. That's not what classical theism is saying. What classical theism is basically going is that how did I put it? So I have a podcast series called "What Do You Mean God Speaks," which is, in a sense, a continuation at a much more general level from my book. And the first episode begins with something like, one of the biggest problem that we have, at least in modern setting, about thinking about God, and the question that we have, because this is one of the central and perhaps the fundamental question against God, right? Against belief in God, which is that you don't need God anymore.
Right.
You have sciences. You have you can be moral. You can be rational. You can have a scientific understanding of the world. All of that without reference to this being that's supposedly super powerful and made everything and is good and all of that. But we can have a worldview that doesn't necessarily include this entity. And my point is that, see, that's where the confusion arises, because for Christianity, at least in the classical sense, God is not an entity. He's not a being among other beings. You're not going to find God in some distant or some grander portion of reality. If you want to translate, because remember, worldviews are like complex language, right? So if I'm using that metaphor, if I were to translate the idea of God from the Christian language to, say, a generally scientific, non-theistic worldview, then I would say a very rough translation would be, God is reality. What you call reality and all of the aspects of it. Because remember, every science that we have is, in a sense, study of reality. You are interacting with reality at all times. Reality also, in a sense, judges you, because, hey, if I do, I don't know, if we form this and that society, let's make everyone like artificially equal economically. I'm referencing communism here.
Mhm.
Everything would work out fine because everyone would be equal. So does that work? Well, reality revealed, or reality responded to that, in a sense understandable yet naive proposition
Mhm.
of applying this Marxist Leninist communism by saying, well, human nature is such that, and reality works in such a way that if you do that, disaster will follow, right? um, yeah, you should still, strive for equality and strive for like less economic, inequality,
Disparities,
yeah,
right. Mhm.
disparities and all of that. But that particular way of interacting with reality, so to speak, won't work. So
Mhm.
in that sense, reality judges you. And when we think about it in that sense, all of the objections, like, hey, who is God that he gets to sort of judge what we do and and punish us and everything. But we actually, if you think about it, in one sense, we actually do think that reality does judge us and punish us in a sense for our actions. Because if we do
Yeah.
something that's stupid or evil or deceitful, it does work back against us.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
the idea of reality, so to speak, and the rationality and the structures of reality and all of that is the closest equivalent to the concept of God in Christianity. That's how we translate it. And the idea of reality, or the logos, or the laws of nature, that they're all sort of meshed in together in that particular sort of family of worldviews, um, is something that's fundamental to their sort of intellectual inquiry and how they understand things and progress toward whatever goal that they have, whether in the sciences or in the ethical journeys and all of that. Well, as Aquinas would put it, that is what we would call God. So the question really shouldn't be, do we need to posit an extra being? Because that's where people get stuck. If at least in the form of, do we really need to have this belief in God? That's where we get stuck. Um, if you understand, or if you're crossing the worldviews into this crossroad that Aquinas did, then the question then becomes not, do we need to posit this being, but that you already have something fundamental to your worldview that's all around you, because reality is about as all around you as you can possibly get. And by the way, reality includes you, right? So it includes yourself and inner experiences, all of that. You already have that which we would call God. So the real question is the questions that come after. Like, does this reality speak to you personally? What is the fundamentals? What is the sort of feature, not feature, character of reality,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
And Aquinas' answer and classical theist answer is that our language and categories simply aren't sufficient to exactly describe this grandest level of reality. We can only use analogy and
Right.
what's called apophatic theology. What it's
Mhm.
not, but it doesn't mean that there's no such reality. It just means that we have limits and we
Mhm.
understand where the limits are. So understand that whatever we say is an analogy. It's spoken with limits, but with that caveat, what is this reality like? Well, divine simplicity. That's where it comes in. Divine simplicity. It's not a physical and composite being made up with parts, because that's probably not how the most fundamental aspect of reality actually functions, right? That's where metaphysics come in. But
Right.
then you have all of this revelation aspect of it, which is, there are times when reality, so to speak, spoke with you and did things that were completely beyond your expectation. And there's a historical sort of journey of a people that sort of built on the previous experiences and established a kind of relationship with all of us that it did. So all of that comes after this talk of the existence of God. So and this is my point in the God at the Crossroads of Worldviews, the way that most of us get stuck with, does God exist, is a sign that we actually don't understand the question that is at play,
Mm. Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
because that's not where we should be stuck on. That's the one where it's like we have a crossroad, done. Let's
Right.
move on, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where my podcast series takes off, because that's the first episode. Do we think there is do we live in reality? Do we have an understanding that, everything around us, there's truth? Some people don't believe, but most people, generally speaking, think that, hey, there is reality, there's rationality to it, there's truth to it. So we get that. Let's move on to the next set of questions.
Yeah. So Paul, I would love to sit here and chat with you all day. We'll have to do a part 2 here. Unfortunately, I just have a call here in 10 minutes. So I want to make sure that people get in touch with the work that you're doing, your podcast, your book, so they can go deeper down this road. I love what you're doing and trying to really establish more productive and fruitful conversations, because I'm with you. I've been online for a while. And kind of wherever you go, some places are better than worse. You do just constantly see this kind of talking past each other, and this, it's unfortunate, right? So the stuff that you're doing is I think really encouraging, trying to find new ways to build on what we share in common, to first identify what that actually is that we have in common. Big fan of all this. So put all the plugs in right now, if you don't mind, Paul. Remind us of your book one more time, and then also the name of your podcast and where people can find that, so they can keep going deeper down this road.
Okay. So book, I actually have it with me because I was trying to review my book. Like, what did I actually write?
I know it's always hard to remember what you wrote even like 2 weeks ago, right?
Wait.
There it is. Very nice. From Notre Dame Press, right?
Yep. Yeah. University of Notre Dame Press, God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. You can see the picture of a
toward a different debate of the existence of God. Very good.
So from University of Notre Dame Press. Now, when the book was reviewed, one of the review, this was, I think, the pre-publication peer review, was a sort of a complimentary, but so it was a sort of a criticism, not really a criticism, but what he said was that this book is sort of like Moses. I'm like, oh, that does sounds impressive. But then what he meant was that the book leads us through the wilderness and shows us the promised land of, how the conversations about God can be. So it's like a promised land, shows us what it is, never takes us there. And it's like, I don't fault him for that, because that's not what the book is about. It does what it's supposed to do, but are you going to take us there? And my hope was that there are smarter people than me who can read the book and say, oh, this is a way to do it, and do it for me. But no one that I know of did so. So I'm like, okay, fine.
It's still early yet.
So I'm like, okay, maybe I will do a simpler, easier version of what that project is going to be. So, which brings us to my podcast series titled, What Do You Mean God Speaks? So you can find that on various platforms, Apple, Spotify, Google, and a number of different ones. So what do you mean God speaks? It will hopefully become a book, because I'm writing a book version of it, which, because it's a book version, will have a radically different structure and probably somewhat different content. And I'll try to find a publisher for that in the next year or two, which is a challenge and one that I'm not looking terribly forward to, but that's what it's up. So those are the things that I'm doing. And it is a series. It's What Do You Mean God Speaks? Sort of goes through different questions like, what do you mean by God? And why asking, is there actually a role for God? It's not a very good question. There's that. What do you mean God created the world? What about the flying spaghetti monster and science? And that's one episode. What do you mean by God speaking? What does that actually entail? What do you mean Bible is the word of God? So all of those questions, that's first season. But then it gets, because I say, then the next set of questions, you actually have to join in the journey. So let's go through Genesis, for example. So you have this creation account, 2 creation accounts, written in a very, very, very different culture with a very different assumptions about how the cosmos is and how it functions. Does that actually mean anything for us? And my answer is, well, if you understand what all of those imageries and ideas mean, like waters, for example, because that's waters don't mean H2O, by the way. Spoiler alert: they're not H2O in the ancient world. So if we put that into play, then what Genesis says is powerful and fascinating. And that's the second season, and it's on third season. Slow down a bit, but that's where it is.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on that. I will be sure to link those resources in the comments at the bottom of this episode, both in the podcast version and YouTube, so people can get connected with you. We will have to do a part 2. This has been fascinating. So, Paul, thanks again for taking the time to be here. It's been an absolute joy.
No, thank you for inviting me, and invite me back anytime.